coming to the next activity, I would like to present some context to you briefly, just to give you a general understanding of my research. So first and foremost, some contextual background, which is relevant to how development practitioners in Vietnam deal with translation and terminology. So it is important to remember a few key things. So first, we should note that in the development sector there, it is still at an early stage for Vietnam to reach a general understanding of development concepts and ideas. So new concepts and knowledge are being introduced into the local context by institutions, by donors and individuals, and this knowledge needs to be researched and adapted. But of course, in the picture of development aid and assistance in Vietnam, there are not only Western donors, but we also have others like Eastern donor countries, such as Japan, Korea, and China. But here, I just want to point out that Vietnam still expects to see significant influence of the global development strategies and initiatives promoted by multilateral organizations. So such as the World Bank, the UN, the ADB, and so on the use of ODA. So in this general picture, we should acknowledge that in the local context, there are Eastern approaches and local value systems towards the understanding and towards development practice, but still the understanding of development ideas, concepts, approaches, practice and policy in Vietnam seem to be primarily associated with the adoption and implementation of the agenda of the Western organizations and donors. So that is why we can take the SDGs as an example of the global development strategies being dominant in the context of Vietnam at the moment. So at this stage, Vietnam is undergoing a process of adjusting and localizing the SDGs, as well as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So on the screen there to the right, we have the localized and translated version of the SDGs in Vietnamese. And we also have a legal document at the central government level in 2017, which defined these localized concepts. So a bit of an overview there about the Vietnam context. And then in my study, I have identified 5 problems of language, translation, and development in general, as you can see there. This might look quite academic, and I hope this will not be so boring for practitioners to listen to, but really I just want to bring the growing concern about language and translation that has been stressed quite strongly by both scholars and practitioners at the moment. So at least from the practitioner's point of view, I think we can acknowledge that these problems may show us how translation and language issues are important and how they might impact development work. So we have first the translation of development as discourse, and second, the role of English in development, and third, how stakeholders need to engage with the terminology of the sector, which we may already have known as the buzzwords and fuzzwords of development. And then we have fourth, the invisible role of translation and of translators and of those who need to engage as part of their job in development with translation. And then finally, we have the issue of lacking adequate policies about translation and language in the development sector, especially at NGOs. So my goal in this research is to study the role or roles of translation and terminology in development practice in Vietnam. And here is what I have found so far. And if you allow, I'm only summarizing the key findings that are related to our topic today. So first, I want to demonstrate here some important cases of different translation and understandings of terminology and development work in Vietnam. So these examples are only preliminary, and from my study, there are more examples, but today I'm only picking a few here to illustrate. For example, we can see development stakeholders in Vietnam have about 10 different ways to translate sustainability into Vietnamese, or civil society organization is translated in 7 different ways, or decent work is translated in 5 different ways. Well, there are somehow more official translations for these terms, such as the translations being used in official government documents or by major organizations and donors, such as the UN, the World Bank, ADB, and so on. But the multiple translations of these terms at least tell us that, you know, although these terms and concepts in English may be well established, the understanding is in the Vietnam context is kind of fuzzy and not that well established. However, you know, when a term has multiple translation, it is not necessarily problematic, because we can have concepts being labeled by different terms, but they are still effectively communicated. That's why in this research, there was the need to investigate how these multiple translations have on policy and practice. And here are a few key impacts, which are mainly drawn from my interviews with development practitioners and stakeholders in Vietnam. For example, many of my respondents explained that terms may have multiple translations because there are highly diverse aspects of meaning associated with the original term and concepts. And although in real life, they understand the concept well in English, when they need to translate and communicate the concept with stakeholders and community members, the equivalent they use would not convey the original meaning well enough. And whatever Vietnamese version available to be used just seem inaccurate. So we can tell what they say is true if we look at the example of well-being in Ireland. And I think the general perception here for most of us is that even for native English speakers, it is not that easy to understand fully the meaning of well-being. So we know that in 2021, the government of Ireland introduced for the first time an initiative called the Wellbeing Framework for Ireland. And here we can see that conceptually, well-being is measured against 11 different dimensions to define the aspects of life being fulfilled under this framework. So that is just an example in reality, but then that brings in some problematic impacts to real life situations of development work. For example, in communication, because some development practitioners are not confident and not convinced enough to use a certain Vietnamese equivalent for well-being. They have not been able yet to explain the concept to local communities. And because the understanding and the translations are so diverse, the practice becomes diverse too as a result. And then we also have other impacts being highlighted by my research participants. For example, they relate the issues of language translation and terminology to issues of trust and power dynamics, which they think is closely related to the dominant role of English in the development sector. For example, imagine a situation of a meeting where translation and interpreting is needed. And when a discussion comes to tension, stakeholders who only speak English or Vietnamese might just discuss among themselves and exclude the others. And even when the key points are later translated or summarized, the other parties may have the feeling that not everything is shared, and then they might have the feeling that they have no power in the discussion. And then many NGOs or in many projects nowadays in Vietnam only recruit staff who can speak English or who can translate. So my participants were reporting on how development workers can exert power on local stakeholders this way, because when they speak English, this creates a kind of power illusion. And when they translate and mediate at meetings, for example, they can also function as gatekeepers. So that is how power dynamics comes into play. But on the contrary, in fieldwork context, power dynamics might work in a reverse way, because many community members hardly know English. They have no access or very little access to the development agenda and ideas being discussed at a higher levels. So they will respect development workers who speak English and who can translate. So sometimes local communities see the translator as a person with power because they do not speak English and they cannot communicate with experts without a translator. So the stakeholders who cannot speak English need to trust the translator in this case. So we can see the impact here is when English is the default language, meaning that people of other languages or of Vietnamese language are limited from participation and from decision making. And then some terms may also be politically sensitive when they have, even when they have already translated and widely used for a long time and almost by everyone. For example, to translate the term civil society organization, traditionally, many would use the equivalent of tổ chức xã hội dân sự. But this equivalent is reported to be, by participants, to be extremely sensitive in the Vietnam context, because the civil society there is often considered as pro-Western, and the local government may not like this. So it is quite popular even nowadays that many CSOs in Vietnam would label themselves with different labels by using softer, more friendly terms, and something that can be transliterated into English as social political organizations doing community work or mass organizations, and they don't call themselves tổ chức xã hội dân sự just to avoid censorship, so that they can participate better in development work. I think this is a good example to show how tricky terminology can be, especially in the Vietnamese context. So trust, power, and politics can resonate with the experience of most of us here today as development practitioners, but I just want to say that translation and terminology could be more about than just language at its worst. So trust, power, and politics are some impacts, but then they're not the only ones. Another big impact that I found so far is related to policy and policy making. For example, I found that the concept resilience is translated into at least 13 different ways. And until 2017, resilience was not present in any official documents or speeches, and also not in any local development interventions, because the local experts didn't mention it at all. So how do we solve problems with translation and terminology then? There are some of the potential solutions in this study. So participants may have made a few key recommendations in terms of developing effective language and translation policies, but also they expect to see these policies being mainstreamed amongst organizations, NGOs and across different programs and projects. And also those who deal with terminology suggest that they would need translation and language tools in place, such as glossaries or lexicons of specialized terms, of different sub-areas of development work. And my participants also have seen the benefits of shared learning, for example, through the emerging communities of practice to deal with the challenges of translation and terminology, such as resilience, which I mentioned earlier. But there is also another aspect of problem solving here, which is front and central to our topic today. That is the importance of local knowledge or vernacular knowledge in translating and understanding development concepts and terminology. And I think we all say that we need to be sensitive to the fact that communities are not homogeneous. So beside the above solutions and the emphasis on respecting local communities in terms of language and culture, from my research, participants also discussed two possible approaches in relation to local knowledge. So the first is an approach called Nom Na. So for English speakers, Nom Na is a Vietnamese expression which can be understood as using popular, simple local language to explain technical and specialist discourse. And the majority of my interviewees use this practice at work, and they think this is a good way to overcome the challenge of thinking from the point of view in English, so that they can enable the concepts to be communicated clearly and fully using Vietnamese language. And then the second approach may not sound directly related to local knowledge, but it actually is. That is the option of not translating at all some of the concepts and terms. So my participants have voiced that instead of having to struggle in choosing between existing translations for terms such as empowerment, resilience, and well-being, and so on, they think that these terms are better not translated. The reason is that they observe in practice the local perspectives and knowledge towards understanding these concepts, and they think that these concepts represent the lived experience of the local communities. So their take is to respect these lived experiences and not to translate these terms. And instead, they choose to not use any fixed terms or any existing Vietnamese equivalents because they think it may be a top-down approach. And not translating these terms is a good move in order to avoid a reductionist way of translating a process or a lived experience. So instead of translating sometimes in the field, these practitioners choose to mention the original terms in English and then tell stories to relate to the essence of the concept. So that's basically a very quick snapshot of my research so far that I wish to introduce as the context, and I hope you find it somehow relevant to your own context of development work. So if you want to discuss more in detail about my study and the findings, I'll be more than happy to do that. And there's my email address there, and it's also in the workshop information and the abstract. So thank you so much.